Imagine for a moment that every hoof, paw, and hand that walks the dry earth today depended not on the storm outside, but on the order inside a single wooden box. Imagine one misstep, one overlooked corner, one moment of panic, and the entire future of terrestrial life undone. That is the premise behind this question. What really happened during 370 days inside Noah's Ark? For 370 days, the survival of humankind and every land animal depended on a sealed space, a handful of people, and the steady discipline of their days. The biblical narrative tells us the outline: entry, God closed the door, the waters came, the waiting, the bird tests, and finally, exit. But beneath that outline lies a web of practical, psychological, and spiritual work that turned salvation into sustainable life. Over the next hour, I want to take you inside that sealed world, carefully, respectfully, and with an eye for both the logistics and the meaning, so that what Noah and his family lived through can shape the way we steward what God has entrusted to us today. First, the ark was a closed system. That phrase sounds technical because it is. A closed system is any environment where what happens inside largely determines whether life continues, what you put in, how you manage it, and what you fail to account for. The ark was a floating, sealed ecosystem. If the animals had arrived healthy but then contagious disease spread, or if waste built up and choked the air, or if imbalance of weight caused structural stress, the waters outside would have been the least of their worries. Small failures inside closed environments accumulate. That's the core risk. A tiny, repetitive motion or a seemingly trivial oversight becomes catastrophic when it happens day after day for more than a year. Consider the ship itself. The text gives us dimensions and a window, and it tells us God shut the door. From those facts, one can reasonably infer three practical priorities that must have dominated Noah's thinking: structural integrity, load distribution, and containment of movement. Wood flexes, repeated waves and rolling put shear stresses on joints and fastenings. On a smaller scale, unsecured tools, loose bundles of feed, or an animal breaking a latch can create sudden shifts that resonate across the structure. The ark needed both a way to keep heavy loads central and a method to isolate transient forces. That plausibly explains why the idea of compartments is so central to many readings of the story. Compartments are not only for species separation. They are a way to manage mass, limit the chain reactions of movement, and give the crew clear, repeatable maintenance zones. Think of it as an analogy, like a space station or a ship at sea, except we must label it an analogy, not a historical claim. The lesson is functional. In a closed space, deliberate layout matters. Heavy animals and supplies placed low and central reduce sway. Breakable items and smaller creatures in padded, sheltered areas reduce noise and accidental collisions. Ropes, pegs, and a discipline of securing things would have been part of daily routine. Over 370 days, the crew could not afford improvisation. Method mattered more than heroic improvisation. Second, the animals didn't need to be captured in a chaotic chase. The text says they came to Noah. That detail changes the risk profile of the operation. Capture would have been dangerous, noisy, and traumatic, exactly the kind of disruption that could spread injury and disease. Instead, the narrative suggests an extraordinary moment of divine ordering in which animals presented themselves. But the arrival still left human responsibilities: containment and behavioral management. Predators and prey cannot simply be placed in the same open room and expect calm. Successful containment would rely on immediate partitioning, predictable feeding schedules, and measures to prevent panic contagion. Compartmentalization served several critical purposes. It reduced direct contact between predator and prey. It allowed teams to specialize in particular zones, and it limited the spread of noise and scent cues that provoke stress behaviors. Imagine a lion pacing within a narrow section while, just a few feet away behind a vertical dividing wall, its natural prey is still present. The plank between them is not only physical separation, it is an architectural way to prevent a cascade, one panicked predator inciting a wave of alarm that spreads across the whole ark. The family's jobs would include calming procedures, sound dampening, consistent feeding that reassures animals, and a rhythm of light and dark to regulate sleep cycles. In short, the Ark functioned like a collection of mini-environments, each with rules and caretakers. Third, food logistics. The text tells us the food was taken aboard, but it does not spell out how it was stored or administered. Still, the practical implications are unavoidable. Over 370 days, the Ark's human crew had to manage 3 interlocking systems: storage, preservation, and distribution. Food for animals and people could not be simply dumped into pens. It had to be measured, sheltered from moisture, and scheduled to avoid waste and conflict. Rationing was not a moralistic austerity. It was survival engineering. Consistent portions prevent animals from overeating, reduce sudden aggression, and stretch limited supplies. We should avoid false precision here. The biblical account does not give us a pantry inventory, and it would be speculative to insist on modern canning or vacuum sealing. But thinking in functional terms, dried forage, compacted grain, sealed baskets, and layered storage that isolates moisture are reasonable interpretations. The crew would have used durable containers and rotated stocks, placing the oldest supplies where they could be used first. Distribution was a labor job. Feeding thousands of animals in a confined space demands organization. Teams would likely move systematically from compartment to compartment with fixed routes to avoid cross-contamination, and they would record consumption patterns to adjust rations as days stretched into months. Fourth, waste management. This is the task most modern readers find least glamorous, yet it may have been the single most existential daily concern. Waste is not merely an unpleasant chore, it is a biological hazard. Decaying matter releases ammonia and other gases, harbors pathogens, and creates breeding grounds for flies and secondary infections. In a closed space, air quality is life quality. The Ark narrative hints at a designed top opening, a window, which suggests that passive ventilation was part of the plan. If so, that opening is a theological and practical anchor. God provided not only protection from the flood, but the means for the inhabitants to keep living inside the protection. Again, label this a plausible interpretation. Passive ventilation, allowing cooler air to enter low and warmer, contaminated air to exit high, would help mitigate humidity and gas buildup. Sloped floors or channels could direct liquid waste to collection areas away from main living compartments. Simple measures like bedding rotation, straw for absorption, and regular removal of soiled material would reduce ammonia concentration. The crew's daily schedule would inevitably include cleaning shifts timed to the animals' feeding cycles. Without such discipline, the Ark's air would have degraded quickly. With it, breathing remained possible for 370 days. Air circulation is tied to thermal balance. A sealed wooden structure exposed to sun and storm will experience wide temperature swings. Too cold and animals' metabolism slow, too hot and heat stress sets in. Ventilation, shade, and perhaps an internal patterning of lighter coverings versus heavier bedding could help maintain a workable microclimate. Again, these are functional hypotheses meant to illustrate how human method cooperated with divine provision. Fifth, animal behavior and stress management. Even with compartments and food, animals carry instincts that surface in confinement: dominance displays, mating behaviors, maternal anxiety, and predator instincts. Human handlers had to minimize triggers. That required not only physical separation but behavioral conditioning. Habits and signals that reassured animals: feed at the same hour, keep certain noises off limits, establish the presence of humans as neutral caretakers rather than threatening captors. Over 370 days, predictability is an antidote to panic. Routine reduces cortisol spikes in animals and humans alike. When routine collapses, contagion of fear spreads rapidly. We must also recognize the role of aroma and sound in animal stress. Scent is primal, keeping waste from saturating the air, sealing predator zones adequately, and dampening abrupt sounds were all strategies to reduce chained reactions. The crew likely developed nonverbal codes, simple adjustments that meant stay calm, food is coming, or this is contained. Those tiny practices, repeated thousands of times, preserved the Ark's internal peace. 6. The human factor. Noah and his family were not passive passengers. The narrative centers Noah as leader, obedient to God's command, vigilant in duty, and responsible for sustaining a micro-society through monotony, noise, and danger. The human tasks included maintenance of the vessel, the care of animals, inventory management, and the moral work of holding a community together when days blend into months and months into nearly a year. Psychologically, prolonged confinement has predictable pressures: boredom, chronic stress, irritability, and the erosion of hope in the face of an indeterminate timeline. The Ark's occupants had no blueprint for what life would look like after 370 days, only the promise that God had acted. That promise did not remove the need for discipline. In such a context, leadership is an infrastructural necessity. A leader keeps schedules, enforces roles, distributes responsibilities, and models calm when fear surfaces. Noah's obedience to God, accepting the command, building the ark, and following instruction, becomes not merely a spiritual act, but a managerial one. Obedience structured survival. So what did a day look like inside the ark? Picture dawn lit through a narrow window, a cool, humid air scented with straw and animal breath. The family wakes, and the first 2 hours are all maintenance. Check the lashings, replace wet bedding, inspect feed bins, and walk borders of the compartments to listen for irregular calls. A feeding team moves systematically, opening a compartment, delivering measured rations, and leaving again. Another team cleans and empties a waste channel guided by gravity toward a collection zone. Noah and one of the adults conduct the most delicate operations, checking predators, calming a mother who won't nurse, attending to an injured limb. At midday, there is a communal pause, not for leisure so much as recalibration, repairing a splintered board, measuring a dwindling sack of grain, cross-checking the animal's consumption. In the evenings, the family gathers briefly to repair tools and to remember the outside world in small rituals, perhaps a prayer, the recounting of God's closing of the door, and a measured hope held in common. Every duty on that ship is spiritual and technical at once. To keep life, you needed hands that could mend, and hearts that could not despair. We must not romanticize. There would have been moments of raw fear. A storm surge could jolt the vessel, animals might cry out in panic, or some infection could appear despite every precaution. In those moments, leadership had to act both decisively and patiently. Decisive to isolate and treat the problem, patient to allow the system of routine to reassert itself. The Ark's survival relied on a balance of quick response and methodical daily discipline. Now consider the timeline toward exit. The bird tests. The narrative gives deliberate staged trials, first the raven, then the dove across several releases. Each test is a measured probe of external conditions and an exercise in patience. The raven's behavior, flying back and forth, tells Noah something about open water and carrion. The dove's successive returns, then return with a leaf, and finally its absence provide calibrated signals. These moments are not emotional leaps. They are data read by a leader who mixes faith with caution. The dove's bringing back a leaf is both a practical confirmation of vegetation and a theological symbol of life returning. The dove that does not return is the decisive sign. Enough stability to risk stepping into the world again. That controlled exit is itself a study in risk management. A hasty disembarkation would expose the animals and humans to unknown disease vectors, unstable ground, and disordered ecosystems. The biblical sequence emphasizes patience and strategy over impulse. The result, when the door finally opened, the people who stepped out were not merely rescued. They were formed. They left having practiced stewardship under pressure, having learned the slow work of rebuilding. What, then, do these practical realities teach us theologically? First, that divine deliverance does not abolish human responsibility. The story repeatedly affirms God's agency. God told Noah, God closed the door, but it also shows that obedience requires work. Noah's obedience is not a passive trust. It is active obedience, building, organizing, feeding, cleaning, and leading. The spiritual lesson is not a shortcut to blessing, but the cultivation of habits that make faith credible and life sustainable. Second, stewardship matters. The ark is a microcosm of stewardship under pressure. God's promise to protect is real, but stewardship is the method by which provision becomes habitation. If we think of the ark as an image for family, church, or a mission, the question is not merely whether we will be saved from storms, but whether we will steward what is saved. That means intentional preparation, clear roles, and the humility to do the daily drudgery that keeps life moving forward. Third, small problems accumulate. The story asks us to notice that the most dangerous threats are rarely the spectacular ones. Instead, they are the overlooked leaks, the unsecured latch, the moment you skip a cleaning shift because you are tired. Over 370 days, tiny failures grow to threaten everything. Spiritual parallel. Little compromises, small resentments, deferred reconciliation, neglected disciplines, over time corrode communities. Fourth, leadership rooted in obedience and method produces resilience. Noah does not survive by charisma alone. He survives because he obeys a command, and because he organizes his people into a functioning crew. That is a call to leaders today. Your steadiness matters more than theatrical heroics. People need routines, clarity of task, and consistent demonstration that someone sees the long term. Fifth, patience and testing are spiritual exercises. The bird releases teach a discipline of waiting with eyes open. Faith does not mean rushing to act at the first sign of change. It means careful testing, discernment, and then decisive movement when your evidence supports it. The dove with a leaf is both biological data and theological promise. The dove that does not return is the green light for a new beginning. What about doubt and faith under pressure? Inside the ark, believing the promise does not mean absence of fear. Fear is a real physical response to conditions. The theology here is honest. Faith coexists with fear and is expressed in the steady work of obedience. Trust that God has acted is expressed by patience, not by passivity. The family's routine, measured feeding, recorded inventories, scheduled maintenance, was faith acted out as labor. We should also note how the ark narrative reframes creation care. The animals were not mere cargo. They were part of God's good creation entrusted to humans. Noah's stewardship is a theological model. Care for the creatures is care for God's workmanship. That ethic matters for contemporary discipleship. How we steward resources, creatures, and communities during seasons of pressure reveals the depth of our obedience. And finally, the exit. When the dove did not return, the decision to disembark was not a leap into an unprepared world, but the culmination of months of careful management, repeated testing, and spiritual formation. The world they entered was new, yes, but those who stepped out were not the same people who had entered. They had been refined by responsibility and shaped by routines. The ark did more than preserve life. It trained survivors to become stewards of a new beginning. So what does this mean for us? If your life, your family, or your organization is in an ark season, a prolonged period of containment or crisis, two paired responses matter. Prepare and practice. Preparation is not panic buying or frantic hoarding. It is intentional arrangement of what you do have into systems that can run when energy and emotion run low. Practice is the daily routine that trains people to do the small tasks that keep the system alive. Put another way, salvation delivers, discipline sustains. We must want both. How practically might a disciple apply these lessons? Start with inventory. What are the non-negotiables you need to sustain life, spiritually, relationally, practically, in a prolonged season? Second, partition responsibilities. Give people clear, specific roles that reduce confusion and spread the burden. Third, establish routine to reduce decision fatigue, meals, prayers, communications, check-ins, so that the essential habits continue even when morale dips. Fourth, monitor air quality. Not literally in every case, but watch for indicators of systemic stress, rising conflict, recurring neglect, or exhaustion. These warning signs, like increasing ammonia on the ark, need immediate attention. Fifth, practice patience. Set reasonable tests and signals that guide collective action rather than impulsive moves based on anxiety. There is also a communal challenge. Are we prepared to be a people who steward what is saved? Too often rescue becomes an endpoint. The Ark teaches that rescue is a beginning. God's deliverance calls for human work, care, discipline, and imaginative recreation. If you lead, this is your mandate. Teach routines, protect the smallest edges where small failures begin, and model obedience under pressure. Before I close, let me return to the image with which we began. For 370 days, a sealed space became the hinge of future history. That hinge turned on both divine sovereignty and human fidelity. God closed the door and provided a path. Noah and his family walked that path in humility and labor. The Ark's success was not a miraculous black box that required no human cooperation. It was a partnership, divine provision plus disciplined stewardship. If this reflection is speaking to you, if you see a season where you are called to steward, to lead, or to prepare, stick around and subscribe for more deep dive studies like this one. In the comments, tell us, which Ark principle will you apply this week? Will you inventory, partition, or set a new routine? Share one small step you will take. As we leave this story, remember that the dove that did not return was not just an ecological fact. It was a sign that cause had met opportunity and that patience had matured into hope. May we, like Noah's family, learn the quiet work of stewardship so that when God opens the door, we step out ready to rebuild well. A brief closing word of prayer. Father, grant us steadiness to do the small, faithful tasks you give us, wisdom to steward what you entrust, and patience to wait on your timing. Help us to lead with humility and to care for your creation as you commanded. Amen.